was rapidly becoming a nightmare to her, for everyone, not Lady Ambermere alone, was audibly wondering when the Guru was coming and when Miss Bracely was going to sing. At the moment, as she paused, a window in the music room was opened and Piggy's odious head looked out. "Oh, Mrs. Lucas," she said, "Goosey and I have got beautiful seats, and Mamma is quite close to the piano where she will hear excellently. Has she promised to sing Siegfried? Is Mr. Georgie going to play for her? It's the most delicious surprise. How could you be so sly and clever as not to tell anybody?" Lucia cloaked her rage under the most playful manner as she ran into the music room through the hall. "You naughty things," she said, "do all come into the garden. It's a garden party, and I couldn't guess where you had all gone. What's all this about singing and playing? I know nothing of it." She herded the incredulous crowd out into the garden again, all in their Hightums, every one of them, only to meet Lady Ambermere with Pug and Miss Lyall coming in. "Better be going, Miss Lyall," she said. "Kindly run out and find my people. Oh, here's Mrs. Lucas. Been very pleasant indeed, thank you. Good-bye. Your charming garden. Yes." "Oh, but it's very early," said Lucia. "It's hardly 6 yet." "Indeed," said Lady Ambermere. "Been so charming." And she marched out after Miss Lyall, out into Shakespeare's garden. It was soon terribly evident that other people were sharing Lady Ambermere's conclusion about the delights of the afternoon and the necessity of getting home. Colonel Boucher had to take his bulldogs for a run and walk off the excitement of the party. Piggy and Goosey explained to their mother that nobody was going to sing, and by silvery laughter tried to drown her just indignation, and presently Lucia had the agony of seeing Mrs. Quantock seated on one of the thrones that had been designed for much worthier ends, and Peppino sitting in the other, while a few guests drifted about the lawn with all the purposelessness of autumn leaves. What with the Guru presumably meditating upstairs still, and with Olga Bracely most conspicuously absent, she had hardly nervous energy left to wonder what could have become of Georgie. Never in all the years of his ministry had he failed to be at her elbow through the entire duration of her garden parties, flying about on her errands like a tripping Hermes, herding her flocks if she wanted them in one part of the garden rather than another, like a sagacious sheepdog, and coming back to heel again ready for further tasks. But today Georgie was mysteriously away, for he had neither applied for leave nor given any explanation, however improbable, of his absence. He at least would have prevented Lady Ambermere, the only cornerstone of the party, from going away in what must be called a huff, and have continued to tell Lucia how marvellous she was and what a beautiful party they were having. With the prospect of 2 other much more magnificent cornerstones, Lucia had not provided any further entertainment for her guests. There was not the conjurer from Brinton, nor the 3 young ladies who played banjo trios, nor even the mild performing doves which cooed so prettily, and walked up their mistress's outstretched fingers according to order if they felt disposed. There was nothing to justify Hightums, there was scarcely even sufficient to warrant Tightums. Scrub was written all over the desert's dusty face. It was about 6:30 when the miracles began, and without warning the Guru walked out into the garden. Probably he had watched the departure of the great motor with its chauffeur and footman and Miss Lyall and Lady Ambermere and Pug, and with his intuitive sagacity had conjectured that the danger from Madras was over. He wore his new red slippers, a wonderful turban, and an ecstatic smile. Lucia and Daisy met him with cries of joy, and the remaining guests, those drifting autumn leaves, were swept up, as it were, by some compelling broom, and clustered in a heap in front of him. There had been a great message, a word of might, full of love and peace. Never had there been such a word. And then, even before they had all felt the full thrill of that, once more the door from the house opened, and out came Olga Bracely and Georgie. It is true that she had still her blue morning frock, which Mrs. Weston had designated as scrub, but it was a perfectly new scrub, and if it had been completely covered with Paris labels, they would not have made its provenance one whit clearer. "Dear Mrs. Lucas," she said, "Mr. Georgie and I are terribly late, and it was quite my fault. There was a game of croquet that wouldn't come to an end, and my life has been guided by only one principle, and that is to finish a game of croquet whatever happens. I missed 6 trains once by finishing a game of croquet. And Mr. Georgie was so unkind, he wouldn't give me a cup of tea or let me change my frock, but dragged me off to see you. And I won." The autumn leaves turned green and vigorous again, while Georgie went to get refreshment for his conqueror, and they were all introduced. She allowed herself to be taken with the utmost docility, how unlike somebody, into the tent with the thrones. She confessed to having stood on tiptoe and looked into Mrs. Quantock's garden and wanted to see it so much from the other side of the wall. And this garden, too. Might she go and wander all over this garden when she had finished the most delicious peach that the world held? She was so glad she had not had tea with Mr. Georgie. He would never have given her such a good peach. Now the departing guests, in their Hightums, lingering on the village green a little, and being rather sarcastic about the utter failure of Lucia's party, could hardly help seeing Georgie and Olga emerge from his house and proceed swiftly in the direction of the Hurst, and Mrs. Antrobus, who retained marvellous eyesight as compensation for her defective hearing, saw them go in, and simultaneously thought that she had left her parasol at the Hurst. Next moment she was walking thoughtfully away in that direction. Mrs. Weston had been the next to realize what had happened, and though she had to go round by the road in her bath chair, she passed Mrs. Antrobus 100 yards from the house, her pretext for going back being that Lucia had promised to lend her the book by Antonio Caporelli, or was it Caporelto? So once more the door into the garden opened, and out shot Mrs. Weston. Olga by this time had made her tour of the garden, and might she see the house? She might. There was a pretty music room at this stage, just as Mrs. Weston was poured out into the garden, as with the floodgates being unopened, the crowd that followed her came surging into Shakespeare's garden, and never had the Mermaid's Tail, behind which was secreted the electric bell, experienced such feverish usage. Pressure after pressure invoked its aid, and the pretext for readmission was soon not made at all, or simply disregarded by the parlour maid. Colonel Boucher might have left a bulldog, and Mrs. Antrobus an ear trumpet, or Miss Antrobus Piggy a shoelace, and the other Miss Antrobus Goosey a shoehorn, but in brisk succession the guests who had been so sarcastic about the party on the village green jostled each other in order to revisit the scenes of their irony. Miss Olga Bracely had been known to enter the portals, and as many of them who entered after her found a guru as well. Olga was in the music room when the crowd had congested the hall. People were introduced to her, and sank down into the nearest chairs. Mrs. Antrobus took up her old place by the keyboard of the piano. Everybody seemed to be expecting something, and by degrees the import of their longing was borne in upon Olga. They waited and waited and waited, much as she had waited for a cigarette the evening before. She looked at the piano, and there was a comfortable murmur from her audience. She looked at Lucia, who gave a great gasp and said nothing at all. She was the only person present who was standing now, except her hostess and Mrs. Weston's gardener, who had wheeled his mistress' chair into an admirable position for hearing. She was not too well pleased, but after all. "Would you like me to sing?" she asked Lucia. "Yes. There's a copy of Siegfried. Do you play?" Lucia could not smile any more than she was smiling already. "Is it very diffy?" she asked. "Could I read it, Georgie? Shall I try?" She slid onto the music stool. "Me to begin?" she asked, finding that Olga had opened the book at the salutation of Brunhilde, which Lucia had practised so diligently all the morning. She got no answer. Olga, standing by her, had assumed a perfectly different aspect. For her gaiety, her lightness, was substituted some air of intense concentrated seriousness, which Lucia did not understand at all. She was looking straight in front of her, gathering herself in, and paying not the smallest attention to Lucia or anybody else. "1, 2," said Lucia. "3, now," and she plunged wildly into a sea of demi-semiquavers. Olga had just opened her mouth, but shut it again. "No," she said, once more, and she whistled the motive. "Oh, it's so diffy," said Lucia, beginning again. "Georgie, turn over." Georgie turned over, and